In the early decades of the 20th century, few names provoked more fascination or fear than Aleister Crowley's. To his followers, he was a prophet, a poet, and the great beast, 66666, a man who dared to challenge religion, morality, and the limits of human consciousness. To his enemies, he was nothing less than the embodiment of evil, a sorcerer, a blasphemer, and the corrupter of youth. Crowley's writings on magic and his creation of the Thelema philosophy made him one of the most notorious occultists in history. He was branded the wickedest man in the world. But behind the scandals, the rituals, and the drug-fueled mysticism, there was another quieter story, one rarely told. Crowley was also a father, a man whose pursuit of power and enlightenment came at the cost of his own family. He had 3 daughters, born to 2 different women who grew up in the shadow of a man obsessed with immortality and rebellion. Their lives, brief and tragic, reveal the human toll of a philosophy that demanded devotion above all else. Who were these daughters of Aleister Crowley? What became of the children of a man who sought to become a god? This is the story of Crowley and his 3 daughters, a tale of magic madness and the quiet suffering left in the wake of a man who thought himself divine. Edward Alexander Aleister Crowley was born on October 12, 1875, in Leamington Spa, England, into a strict, devoutly Christian family. His parents were members of the Plymouth Brethren, a fundamentalist sect that preached purity and obedience. From an early age, Crowley rebelled against everything they stood for. When his father died of tongue cancer, 11-year-old Aleister turned his grief into defiance, rejecting the faith that had dominated his upbringing. He called his mother the Mother of the Beast, a name she gave back to him unknowingly, sealing the title he would later embrace. Educated at Cambridge, Crowley excelled intellectually and athletically, but he was never interested in a conventional life. He immersed himself in mysticism, alchemy, and forbidden texts, seeking truths that religion could not provide. By the turn of the century, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, one of Europe's leading occult societies, and quickly became its most controversial member. His arrogance, genius, and obsession with power alienated his peers, leading to bitter conflicts that ended with his expulsion. From then on, Crowley saw himself as the true heir to magical knowledge. He traveled through Egypt, India, and China, experimenting with drugs, sex rituals, and esoteric practices. In Cairo in 1904, he claimed to have received a revelation from a supernatural being named Aiwass, dictating the Book of the Law. From that text, Crowley founded the religion of Thelema, built on the principle, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." During these years, Crowley also began to build a family, though fatherhood for him was as unconventional as his faith. His first wife, Rose Edith Kelly, married him in 1903. Their relationship began in scandal and ended in tragedy. Together they had 2 daughters, Lilith and Lola Zaza. Later, with his mistress and magical partner, Leah Hirsig, he fathered another daughter, Poupee. While the world viewed him as the prophet of Thelema, his family saw the darker side of his pursuit, the obsessive, destructive man behind the myth. Their story would soon unfold as both deeply human and painfully symbolic of Crowley's descent into obsession. By the early 1910s, Aleister Crowley had achieved notoriety across Europe. He was no longer merely an occultist, he was a scandal. Newspapers called him the wickedest man in the world, and he wore the title like a crown. But while the world fixated on his public persona, his private life was collapsing in ways even darker than his rituals. His first marriage to Rose Kelly began as a passionate rebellion. Rose was intelligent, artistic, and fiercely independent traits that initially fascinated Crowley. Yet the union soon descended into chaos. Both were heavy drinkers and Crowley's increasing addiction to heroin and opium only worsened their volatility. Their first daughter, Lilith, was born in Paris in 1904, the same year Crowley claimed to have received the Book of the Law. He believed Lilith was destined to be a magical child, a being of great spiritual significance. But when Lilith died of typhoid fever in Rangoon at only 2 years old, Crowley's self-proclaimed divinity was shattered. He blamed himself then, blamed Rose, and finally turned his grief into another experiment in human detachment. Their second daughter, Lola Zaza, was born in 1907 amid this turbulence. Rose's mental health deteriorated rapidly. By 1911, she was institutionalized in a sanitarium lost to alcoholism and madness. Crowley, claiming to pursue higher spiritual truths, left Lola in the care of relatives and fled to Italy, France, and beyond, immersing himself in his magical and sexual rituals. Fatherhood to him was another role to be abandoned once it demanded empathy. In the 1920s, he met Leah Hirsig, an American artist, who became his Scarlet Woman, the physical embodiment of Thelema's goddess of desire. Together they founded the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, Sicily, a commune dedicated to free will magic and ritual experimentation. There in 1920, their daughter Poupee was born. But even this child could not anchor Crowley's life. The abbey, notorious for debauchery and animal sacrifice, soon spiraled into scandal when a follower died under mysterious circumstances. In 1923, Mussolini's government expelled Crowley from Italy. Not long after, little Poupee died reportedly of a respiratory infection. By the time Crowley reached middle age, all 3 of his daughters were gone. One lost to disease, one lost to madness, and one lost to neglect. The self-proclaimed prophet of the New Age had conquered mysticism, defied morality, and defiled convention. But in doing so, he had destroyed the very family that bore his name. The years following the collapse of Aleister Crowley's family marked the beginning of his slow and public descent. His reputation as a sorcerer and degenerate had already spread across Europe and America. But now, stripped of his wealth, his followers, and his children, he became a wandering relic of the chaos he once commanded. The man who called himself the Beast 6666 was living proof of what happens when ambition consumes humanity. After his expulsion from Italy, Crowley drifted between France, Germany, and England, carrying with him only manuscripts, debts, and addictions. His heroin habit deepened, destroying his health and clouding his mind. He wrote endlessly poems, essays, and magical diaries, trying to preserve his legacy, even as the world dismissed him as a charlatan. Newspapers mocked him, governments watched him, and former disciples abandoned him. For a man obsessed with immortality, the deaths of his daughters haunted him more deeply than he ever admitted. Though he rarely spoke of them publicly, fragments of grief appeared in his writings. In one poem, he described angels buried in flesh before they could learn to fly, a quiet acknowledgement of Lilith, Lola, and Poupee. Yet Crowley could not reconcile his mystical beliefs with ordinary loss. Instead, he transformed their deaths into symbols proof. He claimed that sacrifice was the price of enlightenment. Lola Zaza, the only daughter to reach adulthood, lived most of her life separated from her father's world. She married and lived under a different name, determined to bury the connection to Crowley. But the weight of his legacy followed her. Even in silence, she could not escape the fascination the world had with the beast. By the 1930s, Crowley was an aging myth, still flamboyant, still manipulative, but increasingly alone. His closest relationships had dissolved, his finances were in ruin, and his cult had fragmented into scattered devotees, still clinging to the idea that he was a prophet. Yet even then, he refused regret. "I may be misunderstood," he once said, but I will never be forgotten. In many ways, he was right. His body of work would outlive him, but so would the ghosts of the daughters he left behind. By the final decades of his life, Aleister Crowley had become both a legend and a cautionary tale. He remained defiant, performing rituals and writing manifestos, but the world had already moved on. His followers were fewer, his wealth was gone, and his health had deteriorated beyond recovery. Yet what endured most was not his magic. It was the myth he created and the ruin he left behind, especially in the lives of those who had once called him father. For his surviving daughter, Lola Zaza, the name Crowley was not a legacy, but a burden. She grew up under the care of her mother's relatives, far removed from the Abbey of Thelema or her father's occult circle. As an adult, she rejected her father's teachings entirely, choosing a quiet life under an assumed name. When interviewed late in life, she refused to speak of him at all, saying only that she did not wish to be part of that story. In silence, she reclaimed her autonomy, something her father's followers had willingly surrendered. Crowley's philosophy of Thelema claimed that every person must find their true will, their divine purpose in life. Ironically, his own daughters became the truest examples of that ideal, not by embracing his teachings, but by rejecting them. Each of his children was drawn into tragedy through his neglect. Yet each in their own way represented the human cost of his pursuit of transcendence. Lilith, who died as an infant, Poupee, who perished amid chaos, and Lola, who lived on only by erasing his name. When Crowley died on December 1, 1947, at a boarding house in Hastings, England, there were few mourners. He was broke, addicted, and nearly forgotten. The only person by his side was a devoted student who claimed that Crowley smiled just before his final breath. His cremation in Brighton drew a small crowd, and during the ceremony, followers read aloud from the Book of the Law, while the press labeled it a black mass. For Lola, who learned of his death through the newspapers, there was no public statement, no closure, no reconciliation. Her father had been many things to many people: a genius, a fraud, a prophet, a monster. To her, he was simply absence, an unfilled space where love should have been. It was in that absence, perhaps, that the true story of Aleister Crowley's family was written. Not in spells or scriptures, but in the silence of those who survived him. The emotional reckoning in the story of Aleister Crowley and his daughters is not found in the man himself, but in the fragments of humanity that surrounded him. Crowley spent his life preaching that love was the law, yet his own version of love consumed rather than created. For his daughters, that contradiction became the core wound of their existence, to be born of a man who preached enlightenment but delivered suffering. For Crowley, grief was never something to confront honestly. When his first daughter Lilith died, he buried his sorrow beneath doctrine. He turned the loss into mysticism, writing that her death was a divine offering to higher powers. It was a chilling glimpse into how far he had drifted from empathy. Rose Kelly, Lilith's mother, broke under the weight of that philosophy. Her descent into madness was as much a spiritual casualty as a psychological one. Lola Zaza, the second daughter, grew up hearing the whispers, the daughter of the beast. Yet she rejected both the shame and the fame attached to her father's name. In adulthood, she avoided reporters and refused to read his works, saying that her father's world was not meant for human beings. For her, survival meant forgetting. Even in death, Crowley sought control. His writings often mused that family was a trap, that attachment was the enemy of enlightenment. But as his body weakened and his following dwindled, a subtle change crept into his diaries. He wrote about loneliness as the final test, a rare glimpse of vulnerability from a man who once believed himself divine. Though he never expressed remorse, His words carried the faint echo of realization that his quest for immortality had left him utterly alone. That was the unspoken revelation, the truth he could never admit. Crowley had spent his life chasing gods, and in the process, he destroyed the only thing truly human about himself, his capacity to love and be loved. His daughters, in their silence, became the final mirror of that truth. They did not worship him, nor curse him, they simply lived without him. Their quiet existence stands as the real legacy of Aleister Crowley. Not his rituals or his words, but the people who walked away from them. In the decades that followed Aleister Crowley's death, his name continued to haunt the fringes of culture, resurrected in rock lyrics, occult movements, and sensational biographies. He became an icon of rebellion, worshipped by those who never knew the man, only the myth. But for the few who carried his blood, the challenge was not to understand his philosophy. It was to escape it. Of his 3 daughters, only one, Lola Zaza, lived into adulthood. Her quiet defiance became the counterpoint to her father's chaos. While Crowley's admirers invoked him as a prophet of freedom, Lola lived hers in the simplest form by disappearing. She married, had a child, and lived under a different name, refusing to participate in the industry of myth that grew around her father. Where he sought immortality through notoriety, she sought peace through obscurity. In her silence, she achieved what he never could control. For those who later studied Crowley's life, Lola's survival became a kind of moral compass, a reminder that genius without empathy breeds destruction. She embodied the final act of rebellion against the man who claimed to have transcended human feeling. By choosing anonymity, she denied the world the spectacle it demanded. Meanwhile, Crowley's influence continued to ripple through generations of seekers and artists. The Beatles placed his face on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page bought his former estate. His writings on willpower and individuality resurfaced in countercultural manifestos. Yet the deeper truth of Crowley's legacy remained personal, not mystical. That even the most celebrated mind can leave behind nothing more than fractured lives. For his surviving daughter, and for those who inherited the name indirectly, the search for identity became an act of reclamation. They could not choose their ancestry, but they could choose how to live beyond it. Crowley had written, "The Scarlet Woman is the flame of life itself." Lola's life, quiet and unrecorded, proved that light can still exist after the fire burns out. In the end, the story of Aleister Crowley's daughters is not one of magic or destiny, it is one of endurance. Their strength lay not in following his path, but in surviving it. Aleister Crowley died in 1947, impoverished, addicted, and still convinced that he had reshaped the destiny of mankind. He left behind a mountain of writings, a scattered group of disciples, and a reputation that straddled genius and blasphemy. For the world, he became the eternal symbol of forbidden knowledge, a man who dared to challenge God and the consequence that followed. But for his daughters, he left behind something far more human and devastating absence. Lilith died before she could speak his name. Poupee perished in the chaos of his collapsing empire. Only Lola Zaza lived long enough to see her father turned into a myth and chose with deliberate silence to reject it. In doing so, she closed the final chapter of the Crowley bloodline, transforming his legacy of rebellion into one of quiet resistance. Where he sought immortality through fame, she found meaning in anonymity. History remembers Aleister Crowley as the Great Beast, a man who stood at the crossroads of mysticism and madness. But the truth of his story lies not in the rituals he performed or the followers he commanded. It lies in what he lost. In his pursuit of transcendence, he sacrificed connection. In his obsession with eternal life, he destroyed the lives closest to him. His daughters in their fragile humanity are the counterspell to his myth. They remind us that every legend of darkness casts a shadow that must be lived with by others. Their story is one of survival, not belief proof that even the children of chaos can seek peace. And so, decades after his death, the question remains, what endures longer, the name of a man who courted infamy, or the silence of those who refused to carry it forward? Perhaps the true legacy of Aleister Crowley is not written in his books, but in the quiet decision of his daughters to live beyond his reach. Through them, the myth finds its reckoning. Through their silence, his echo finally fades.